The silver dollar spun in the lamplight, catching fire with each rotation before landing with a metallic ring on the mahogany desk. Catherine Brennan watched it settle, tails up, and felt her world tilt on its axis. "Heads, you live," whispered the man across the desk, his manicured fingers drumming against the leather-bound ledger. "Tails, you pay what your husband truly owed." The coin lay between them like a verdict. Around the opulent bank office, shadows danced from the oil lamps, creating phantoms that seemed to mock her predicament. Outside, the midnight streets of Tombstone echoed with distant laughter from the saloons, oblivious to the fact that Catherine's life hung in the balance of a simple coin toss. But this wasn't about luck. It was about a debt she'd never known. Existed a game she'd never agreed to play, and a husband whose secrets were about to destroy everything she'd built. What Catherine didn't know yet was that the silver dollar spinning on that desk was the same coin her husband had used to make his final bet 3 months ago. The bet that had cost him his life and made her a widow with a fortune in debt she couldn't possibly pay. But to understand how a respectable banker's wife ended up staring at her own death sentence in a late-night office meeting, we need to go back to the beginning, back to when Catherine thought she knew who her husband was, and back to the day she discovered that some secrets are worth killing for. Tombstone, Arizona Territory, 1883. Catherine Brennan believed in order, in neat columns of figures in proper documentation, in the comforting predictability of compound interest. At 28, she ran the Tombstone Territorial Bank with an efficiency that impressed even the hardened miners who'd seen every kind of crooked dealing in their day. Her husband's office reflected that same precision. Every document filed correctly, every transaction recorded in his careful script, every loan properly secured with collateral that could be liquidated if necessary. James Brennan had built the most trusted financial institution between Phoenix and El Paso, and Catherine had helped him do it, ledger by ledger, deposit by deposit, which was why the discrepancy in the books made no sense. Catherine sat in the pre-dawn quiet of the bank, oil lamp casting steady light on the monthly reconciliation that should have been routine. Instead, she stared at numbers that refused to balance. According to her meticulous records, they should have had nearly $8,000 more in the vault than what she'd counted yesterday. She rechecked her arithmetic twice, then pulled out James's personal ledger to cross-reference. Her husband was methodical about documentation, had to be, in a territory where handshake deals and trust were luxuries that could bankrupt you overnight. But James's personal ledger contained entries that made Catherine's blood run cold. Payment T. Morrison, $500 personal. Stakes advanced to Silver Palace, $1,200, temporary loan. Settlement with Murphy Brothers, $2,300, private matter. Catherine had never heard of T. Morrison, didn't know James frequented the Silver Palace gambling hall, and had no idea who the Murphy brothers were. But the dates on these entries explained exactly where their missing money had gone. Her husband had been gambling, not just gambling, losing, badly. The front door's bell chimed, making her jump. Through the frosted glass she could see a familiar silhouette, Sheriff John Bian, making his morning rounds. She quickly closed the ledgers and smoothed her dark hair before walking to the door. "Morning, Catherine." Bian touched his hat, rimmed, his eyes holding the careful sympathy she'd grown tired of over the past 3 months. "Just checking on things. You know how it is. She knew. Ever since James's death, every man in Tombstone had appointed himself her unofficial protector. The grieving widow who'd inherited a bank was seen as either vulnerable prey or a valuable prize, depending on the man's character. I'm managing fine, Sheriff. The bank's business continues as usual. Ian nodded, but lingered on the threshold. Catherine, I don't mean to pry, but folks have been asking questions about some of James's associations before he died. What kind of questions? Well, you know how this town talks. Someone mentioned seeing him at the Silver Palace more than once. Another fellow claims James owed him money from a poker game. Ian studied her face carefully. I figured you'd want to know what people were saying. Catherine kept her expression neutral, but her stomach twisted. If the sheriff was hearing rumors about James's gambling, how long before those rumors reached their depositors? A bank survived on trust, and trust was fragile as morning frost in Arizona. Idle gossip, Sheriff. James was a careful man with money. I'm sure he was. But, Catherine, if there's anything you need help with, anything that might be irregular, you can trust me. After being left, Catherine returned to the ledgers with new urgency. If gossip was already circulating about James's gambling, she needed to understand exactly how deep the problem went. She pulled out his private papers from the safe, documents she'd avoided looking at during her grief. What she found made the missing $8,000 look like pocket change. James hadn't just been gambling. He'd been borrowing money to gamble with, using the bank's assets as collateral. Worse, he'd apparently been losing to the same group of men repeatedly, men whose names appeared in conjunction with phrases like extension granted and additional security required. The Silver Palace wasn't just a gambling hall. According to the papers Catherine found, it was owned by a consortium of businessmen who used it as a front for a private banking operation. They loaned money at rates that would make the most hardened usurer blush, secured their loans with property and businesses, and had a reputation for collecting debts with methods the territorial courts didn't recognize. James hadn't just been gambling. He'd been doing business with loan sharks who operated outside the law. And according to the final document in his private papers, a promissory note dated 2 weeks before his death, James owed them $15,000, with the bank itself listed as collateral. Catherine sat back in her chair, the magnitude of her situation becoming clear. If this debt was legitimate, and if these men decided to collect, she could lose everything. The bank, her house, her reputation, everything she and James had built over 8 years of marriage. But there was something else bothering her about the documents. James's handwriting was distinctive, precise, careful, each letter formed with the attention to detail that had made him successful. But some of these signatures looked different, hurried, as if he'd been under pressure when he signed them, or as if someone else had signed them. Catherine had seen enough forged documents in her banking career to recognize the signs. She pulled out a magnifying glass and examined the promissory note more carefully. The ink was different on James's signature than on the rest of the document. The pressure of the pen strokes varied in ways that suggested the signature had been added after the document was written. Her husband hadn't signed this note. Someone had forged his signature after his death, creating a debt that had never existed. But that raised an even more disturbing question. If someone was willing to forge documents to claim James owed them $15,000, what had they done to make him look like he'd died of natural causes? Catherine had accepted the doctor's explanation that James had suffered a heart attack in his sleep. At 52, he'd been under stress from the bank's expansion, had been eating poorly and sleeping less. A heart attack seemed plausible, even predictable. But men with healthy hearts didn't typically die in their sleep unless something helped them along. As Catherine sat in the morning light filtering through the bank's windows, she realized her husband hadn't just left her a business to run. He'd left her a mystery to solve. And if her suspicions were correct, solving it might be the only way to stay alive long enough to expose the truth. The bell chimed again, and this time the silhouette in the frosted glass made Catherine's blood chill. 3 men in expensive suits, standing too close together, waiting with the patience of predators, who knew their prey had nowhere to run. She recognized the man in front from James's description in his private notes. Thomas Morrison, the T. Morrison, who'd received $500 in personal payments. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of soft features that suggested a life spent indoors counting other people's money. Catherine straightened her shoulders and walked to the door. If these men were here to collect a forged debt, they were about to learn that Catherine Brennan wasn't the helpless widow they'd expected to find. But as she reached for the door handle, she caught sight of something that made her freeze. The man standing behind Morrison had his coat unbuttoned, revealing the handle of a pistol. This wasn't a business meeting. It was a collection call, and Catherine was about to discover that some debts were collected in blood, regardless of whether they'd ever been legitimately owed. Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she turned the lock and opened the door. The 3 men entered without. Invitation, Morrison leading with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. The armed man closed the door behind them and positioned himself near it, blocking her exit. Mrs. Brennan. Morrison's voice was smooth, cultured with the hint of an Eastern accent. I'm Thomas Morrison. I believe your late husband mentioned me. Catherine nodded toward the chairs facing her desk. Please sit. Though I should mention the bank doesn't officially open for another 2 hours. This isn't bank business, Mrs. Brennan. This is personal. They settled into the chairs while Catherine took her position behind the desk, James's desk, though she'd been effectively running the bank's operations for years. She kept her hands visible and relaxed, a technique James had taught her for dealing with difficult customers. How can I help you, Mr. Morrison? Morrison reached into his coat slowly, keeping his movements visible, and withdrew a leather portfolio. I'm here about a debt your husband owed our organization. A substantial debt that's now passed to you as his heir. I wasn't aware it had any outstanding personal debts. Perhaps not. James was discreet about certain aspects of his financial activities. Morrison opened the portfolio and removed the promissory note Catherine had discovered that morning. $15,000, borrowed over a period of 18 months to cover gambling losses at the Silver Palace. Catherine examined the document, pretending she was seeing it for the first time. This is dated 2 weeks before James's death. He was hoping to resolve his situation before involving you. Unfortunately, his heart gave out before he could arrange repayment. I see. Catherine set the note down carefully. And you expect Me to honor a debt I knew nothing about, secured with assets I wasn't consulted about, based on a promissory note I can't verify? Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Brennan, I understand this is overwhelming, but debt doesn't die with the debtor. Your husband's obligations are now your obligations. Not under territorial law, they aren't. Community property. Statutes protect widows from assuming their spouse's gambling debts, particularly when those debts weren't disclosed during the marriage. The armed man behind Morrison shifted slightly, and Catherine caught the movement in her peripheral vision. She was saying things they didn't want to hear. Mrs. Brennan, Morrison continued, his tone growing slightly harder, territorial law is one thing. Practical reality is another. Your husband borrowed money from people who don't typically involve lawyers in their collection processes. Are you threatening me, Mr. Morrison? I'm explaining your situation. $15,000. Plus 18 months of accumulated interest at 5% per month comes to $27,000. You can pay this debt, or you can deal with the consequences of defaulting. Catherine had expected this moment since she discovered the forged signature that morning. She reached into her desk drawer, and all three men tensed until she withdrew. A magnifying glass. Before we discuss payment, I'd like to examine this document more carefully. She made a show of studying the promissory note, pointing out details she'd already noticed. This is interesting. The ink used for James's signature is different from the ink used for the rest of the document. See how it has a slightly different color composition. Morrison's expression didn't change, but she saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Also, Catherine continued, the pressure marks on the paper don't match. When someone signs a document, they typically press harder on certain letters, usually the first letter of each name. But this signature shows even pressure throughout, which suggests it was copied rather than written naturally. She set down the magnifying glass and looked directly at Morrison. This is a forgery, Mr. Morrison. James never signed this document. The silence that followed stretched tight as a piano wire. The third man, younger than the others, with nervous eyes, glanced between Morrison and his armed companion. Catherine could practically see him wondering if this was the moment things turned violent. Mrs. Brennan, Morrison said finally, his voice deadly calm, you're accusing me of fraud. That's a serious allegation. I'm pointing out obvious evidence that this document has been altered. If you'd like to dispute my findings, we can certainly involve Sheriff Bean and the territorial prosecutor. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. You know, James never mentioned how astute his wife was with financial documents. James taught me well, including how to spot forged signatures, altered documents, and fraudulent loan instruments. And what do you propose we do about this situation, Mrs. Brennan? Catherine had been thinking about this moment since she discovered the forgery. She had several options, none of them good. She could expose the fraud and hope the law would protect her. She could try to negotiate a smaller settlement to make the problem disappear. Or she could gamble everything on a much more dangerous proposition. I propose we discuss what really happened to my husband. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Morrison's cultured facade cracked slightly, revealing something much harder underneath. Your husband died of natural causes, Mrs. Brennan. Heart failure. Very sad, but hardly uncommon for a man his age. A man his age who was being pressured to pay debts he'd never incurred. A man who discovered someone was using forged documents to steal his bank. Catherine leaned forward. "How much pressure were you applying, Mr. Morrison?" "Enough to stop a man's heart?" The armed man's hand drifted toward his pistol, but Morrison held up a restraining gesture. "You're walking into very dangerous territory, Mrs. Brennan." "I've been in dangerous territory since the moment you forged my husband's signature. The question is, what are you willing to do to keep this quiet?" Morrison studied her for a long moment, reassessing. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, respectful, but with an undercurrent of threat. "What exactly are you proposing?" Catherine reached into her desk and withdrew a different document, one she'd prepared that morning after discovering the extent of James's real gambling debts. Not the imaginary 15,000 claimed in the forged note, but the actual 3,000 he'd legitimately lost at the Silver Palace. James did owe money for gambling losses. $3,000 which I'm prepared to pay today to settle his real debts. In exchange, you destroy that forged promissory note, and we pretend this conversation never happened. And if we refuse, then I take my evidence to Sheriff Behan, along with my suspicions about James's death, and we let the territorial prosecutor sort out who's telling the truth." Morrison was quiet for nearly a minute, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. Finally he nodded to the armed man, who reached into his own coat and withdrew an envelope. "Mrs. Brennan, you've impressed me. James was right about your intelligence." He slid the envelope across the desk. "But intelligence can be dangerous when it's applied to the wrong problems." Catherine opened the envelope and found a photograph inside. It showed her walking to the bank yesterday morning, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. The image was sharp, professional, recent. "We know your routines, Mrs. Brennan. We know you live alone, that you walk to work at the same time each morning, that you stay late most evenings to balance the books." Morrison's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "We know you're vulnerable, and I know you're murderers." Catherine set the photograph down without flinching. "So we're even." Morrison laughed, genuinely amused rather than threatening. "You know, in different circumstances, I think we could have done business together. You have exactly the kind of nerve we look for in our associates. Is that an offer, Mr. Morrison? It's a recognition of mutual respect. You're too smart to fight us directly, and we're too practical to eliminate someone who could be useful." He stood and gestured for his men to do the same. "We'll accept your offer. 3,000 to settle James's real debts. But Mrs. Brennan?" "Yes?" "If you ever mention your theories about your husband's death to anyone, that photograph will be the last thing you see." After they left, Catherine sat alone in the morning silence, her hands finally beginning to shake with delayed reaction. She'd just negotiated with her husband's killers and lived to tell about it. But she'd also learned something valuable. Morrison's organization wasn't just a collection agency. They were sophisticated enough to have professional surveillance, ruthless enough to commit murder, and organized enough to forge complex financial documents, which meant James hadn't just stumbled into debt with local loan sharks. He'd somehow gotten involved with a criminal organization operating at a much higher level. And if Catherine was going to survive long enough to expose them, she needed to understand exactly how deep this conspiracy went. She walked to the safe and removed a different set of documents, ones she hadn't shown Morrison. James's real, private papers, including correspondence that revealed the true scope of what he discovered before his death. The Silver Palace wasn't just a gambling hall used for money laundering. It was the front for a territorial-wide operation that was systematically taking over banks, mining claims, and real estate through fraud, forgery, and, when necessary, murder. And James hadn't been their victim. He'd been their partner until he'd tried to get out. Catherine spread James's hidden correspondence across the desk, documents she'd discovered in a secret compartment of their home safe after his death. Letters painted a picture of her husband she'd never suspected, not the victim of ruthless loan sharks, but their willing accomplice in a criminal enterprise that stretched across. Documents, and the scope of the investigation had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. Catherine sat in a secured conference room, surrounded by stacks of evidence that had grown from James's original cache. Other victims had come forward. Bank presidents, property owners, mining executives who'd been defrauded by Morrison's organization. Each new witness brought additional evidence, and the conspiracy had revealed itself to be far more extensive than even James had realized. U.S. Attorney General Harrison Webb had arrived from Washington the previous day, accompanied by a team of federal prosecutors. The investigation had grown too large and politically sensitive for territorial authorities to handle alone. Mrs. Brennan, Attorney General Webb, addressed her across the conference table. "Your husband's documentation has been invaluable, but we need your testimony to tie everything together. Are you prepared to testify before a federal grand jury?" Catherine nodded, though her stomach clenched at the thought. "What kind of protection can you provide?" "Morrison's people have made it clear they'll kill me to prevent my testimony." "Federal witness protection. New identity, relocation to another territory, financial support until you can reestablish yourself." Webb's expression was grave. "But I won't lie to you. It means leaving everything you've built here forever." Marshal Davidson leaned forward. "Catherine, we've arrested 12 members of Morrison's organization, including Morrison himself, but the corruption goes deeper than we initially realized. The territorial governor, 2 federal judges, and at least 6 members of the territorial legislature were taking bribes. What about Morrison? Is he talking? Not yet. He's hired expensive lawyers and claims he was simply a businessman operating within territorial law." Marshal Cole shook his head. "But with your testimony and James's documents, we have enough evidence to convict him and most of his associates." Catherine studied the faces around the table. Federal prosecutors, marshals, investigators who'd traveled from Washington to dismantle a criminal conspiracy that had grown like cancer through the territorial government. Her husband's death had triggered a federal investigation that was reshaping the power structure of the American Southwest. "There's something else you need to know," she said. "James wasn't Morrison's only partner in the banking community. He mentions other bankers. In his letters, people who were helping with document fraud in exchange for a share of the profits." Attorney General Webb's expression sharpened. "Do you have names?" Catherine reached into her briefcase and withdrew a list she'd compiled from James's correspondence. 14 bankers across 5 territories. James documented their involvement in specific operations, including dates and amounts. The room fell silent as Webb reviewed the list. Several names were prominent figures in territorial banking, men whose institutions held deposits from territorial governments and federal agencies. "My God," Webb muttered. "If this is accurate, Morrison's organization wasn't just stealing private property. They were embezzling federal funds deposited in these banks, which makes this a federal crime regardless of territorial jurisdiction," one of the prosecutors added. Catherine felt a grim satisfaction watching the federal officials realize the magnitude of what James had uncovered. Her husband had died trying to expose a conspiracy that threatened the financial stability of the entire Southwest. Now his evidence would ensure that conspiracy was dismantled completely. But her satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that testifying would mean the end of her life in Tombstone. The bank she'd helped build, the home she'd shared with James, the community where she'd established her identity, all of it would have to be abandoned in exchange for justice and survival. "Mrs. Brennan," Marshal Davidson said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, but your testimony could prevent hundreds of other families from being victimized by these criminals. Your husband died trying to protect people from Morrison's organization. Now you have the chance to finish what he started." Catherine looked around the room at the federal officials who'd come to Arizona because of James's evidence. Her quiet husband, the methodical banker who'd seemed almost boring in his predictability, had documented one of the largest criminal conspiracies in territorial history. He'd paid for that documentation with his life, but it was about to bring justice to hundreds of victims. "I'll testify," she said finally, "but I have conditions." Attorney General Webb raised an eyebrow. "What conditions?" "First, I want Morrison charged with my husband's murder, not just financial fraud. James was killed because he threatened to expose this conspiracy, and I want his death to be part of the prosecution. That may be difficult to prove legally. Then make it part of a plea arrangement. Morrison pleads guilty to conspiracy charges and admits to ordering James's death in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. We made notes on a legal pad. What else? Second, I want the victims of Morrison's organization to recover their stolen property. Not just monetary compensation, actual return of the lands and businesses that were taken through fraud. That's already part of our restitution plan." Catherine stood and walked to the window overlooking Phoenix's main street. Below, ordinary people went about their daily business, unaware that their territorial government had been corrupted by criminals. James had died trying to protect people like them. "Third," she said without turning around, "I want to help prosecute the case, not just testify, actively participate in building the prosecution. I know more about banking fraud than anyone in this room, and I want to make sure Morrison's organization is completely dismantled." "Mrs. Brennan, that's highly irregular. Witnesses don't typically participate in prosecution strategy." Catherine turned back to face the room. "Witnesses typically don't have master's degrees in banking and finance from Eastern universities. They don't have 8 years of experience detecting financial fraud, and they don't have personal knowledge of how these criminals operate." The silence that followed was broken by Attorney General Webb's quiet chuckle. "Mrs. Brennan, are you proposing to join the Justice Department?" "I'm proposing to make sure the people who killed my husband never have the opportunity to kill anyone else's husband. If that means working for the federal government, then yes." Webb exchanged glances with his team of prosecutors. It's unprecedented. But given the scope of this case and your unique qualifications, we might be able to arrange something temporary. Not temporary, permanent. I want a career prosecuting financial fraud, and I want to start by destroying Morrison's organization so completely that it can never reconstitute itself. Marshal Davidson smiled for the first time since Catherine had met him. You know, James would be proud of you. He died trying to bring down these criminals, and you're going to finish the job. Catherine felt tears threatening, the first she'd allowed herself since James's funeral. He documented everything because he believed the truth mattered. Now, I'm going to make sure it does. 3 months later, the federal courthouse in Phoenix was packed for the opening of United States v. Morrison. 18 defendants sat at the defense table, including Morrison himself, territorial officials, and corrupt bankers from across the Southwest. Catherine Brennan, now Special Prosecutor Catherine Brennan, sat at the government's table, having been sworn in as a federal attorney the previous week. The evidence James had documented filled 12 boxes and included testimony from 63 witnesses. Morrison's criminal organization had stolen over $2 million in property and had corrupted officials at every level of territorial government. But most importantly for Catherine, Morrison had agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for a life sentence instead of execution. As part of his plea agreement, Morrison had also admitted to ordering James Brennan's death, providing closure to the question that had haunted Catherine since discovering her husband's body. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Catherine addressed the packed courtroom, her voice carrying clearly to every corner. James Brennan died because he believed the truth was more important than his own safety. Today, we honor his sacrifice by ensuring that truth prevails over corruption. She gestured toward the defense table where Morrison sat in shackles, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow expression of a man watching his empire crumble. The defendant didn't just steal money or property. He stole something more valuable. He stole trust. Trust in our financial institutions. Trust in our legal system. Trust in the very foundations of civilization on the frontier. Catherine's voice grew stronger as she continued, drawing on months of preparation and years of suppressed anger over James's death. But today we restore that trust. Today we prove that no criminal organization is too powerful, no conspiracy too vast, and no criminal too connected to escape justice when ordinary citizens have the courage to stand up and tell the truth. Morrison's lead attorney had argued that his client was merely a businessman operating within the loose legal framework of territorial law, but Catherine had systematically dismantled that defense with James's meticulous documentation, showing the jury exactly how Morrison's organization had perverted legitimate banking practices to steal millions of dollars. The trial lasted 6 weeks. When the jury returned guilty verdicts on 3 territories. The first letter, dated 2 years earlier, was from Morrison himself. James, the Phoenix operation was a complete success. The bank president never suspected the loan documents were altered until after we'd transferred ownership. Your expertise in financial documentation continues to prove invaluable. Your share comes to $8,500, deposited as agreed into the Denver. Catherine felt sick reading it. James hadn't been gambling away their money. He'd been earning it by helping criminals steal banks through document fraud. The careful, methodical man she'd married was a forger and a thief. But as she read further, the story became more complex. A letter from 6 months before James's death showed a different tone. Morrison, I cannot continue with the Tucson operation. The bank president is a family friend, and his children attend church with Catherine. Find another way to acquire the property. I'm starting to have serious concerns about our methods. Morrison's reply was brief and ominous. James, your conscience is a luxury we cannot afford. The Tucson acquisition proceeds as planned. Your participation is not optional. Catherine found herself reading about a man she'd never really known. James had apparently started as a willing partner in financial fraud, using his legitimate banking expertise to create convincing forgeries that allowed Morrison's organization to steal properties and businesses. But somewhere along the way, his conscience had awakened, and he tried to extract himself from the partnership. The final letters told the story of that extraction attempt. James had demanded out of the organization, threatening to expose their operations if they didn't. Release him. Morrison had responded by reminding James that partners who knew too much couldn't simply walk away. The last letter, dated 1 week before James's death, was in James's handwriting. Morrison, I've documented everything, every operation, every forged document, every stolen property. If anything happens to me, Catherine will find the evidence and know exactly what to do with it. Leave me alone, and our secrets die with me. Continue to pressure me, and everything you've built will burn. Catherine sat back, understanding finally settling over her like a shroud. James hadn't died of a heart attack. He'd been murdered because he'd threatened to expose Morrison's criminal organization. And Morrison had killed him believing that James's threat about documented evidence was a bluff. But it hadn't been a bluff. Catherine was holding that evidence. Right now. She walked to the bank's main vault and used her key to access the private deposit boxes. James had rented box 247 under an assumed name, paying the rental fees through a separate account Catherine had never known existed. Inside, she found what he'd promised Morrison he'd documented, a complete record of their criminal operations. Going back 5 years, bank acquisitions in Phoenix, Tucson, and Denver, mining claim thefts in Colorado and New Mexico, property frauds that had displaced dozens of families. Morrison's organization wasn't just stealing individual properties. They were systematically acquiring control of the financial infrastructure of the American Southwest. But the most damning document was a list of names, not just Morrison and his immediate associates, but politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials who were either part of the conspiracy or being paid to ignore it. Sheriff Bean's name was on the list, along with the territorial governor and 3 federal judges. James had discovered that Morrison's organization was operating with official protection at the highest levels of territorial government, which explained how they could commit fraud and murder with impunity. It also explained why Catherine's situation was much more dangerous than she'd realized. She wasn't just fighting a criminal organization, she was fighting a conspiracy that included the very people she'd normally turn to for protection. The bank's front door chimed, and Catherine quickly locked the deposit box and returned to her desk. Through the frosted glass, she could see Sheriff Bean again, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 other men stood with him, both carrying themselves with the rigid posture of federal marshals. Catherine's heart raced as she considered her options. If Bean was part of Morrison's organization, then these federal marshals might be here to arrest her on fabricated charges. Or worse, they might be here to ensure her silence permanently. She slipped James's evidence into her desk drawer and walked to the door, keeping her expression neutral despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Sheriff Bean, gentlemen. Catherine, these are U.S. Marshals Davidson and Cole from the territorial capital. They'd like to ask you some questions about James's business dealings." Marshal Davidson was tall and lean with prematurely gray hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent his career dealing with frontier justice. His partner was younger, maybe 30, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the bank's interior. "Mrs. Brennan, we're investigating irregularities in several territorial banks. Your husband's name has come up in connection with some questionable loan documents." Catherine's mind raced. Were these legitimate federal investigators or Morrison's people wearing badges? The only way to find out was to test their knowledge. "What kind of irregularities, Marshal?" "Forged signatures, altered loan terms, fraudulent transfers of ownership. We have evidence that someone with sophisticated knowledge of banking procedures has been helping criminals acquire properties through document fraud." Marshal Cole stepped forward. "Mrs. Brennan, we know your husband was involved. The question is whether you were part of it or whether you're another victim." Catherine made her decision. If these men were legitimate federal marshals, they represented her only hope of surviving Morrison's organization. If they were criminals, she was probably dead regardless of what she said. "Marshals, I think you need to see something." She led them to her desk and withdrew James's correspondence. "My husband wasn't just involved in document fraud. He was murdered because he tried to get out." Davidson's expression sharpened as he read the letters. "Mrs. Brennan, do you understand what you're showing us? Evidence that my husband was killed to keep him quiet about a criminal conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of territorial government." Marshal Cole looked up from the documents, including law enforcement. Catherine glanced at Sheriff Bean, who had gone pale, reading over the marshal's shoulder. "Sheriff, your name's on James's list of people being paid to ignore Morrison's activities." Bean's hand moved toward his gun, but Marshal Davidson was faster. "Easy, Sheriff. Let's talk about this reasonably." "John," Davidson said quietly, "you can cooperate with our investigation, or you can go down with Morrison and his people. Your choice." Bean's shoulders sagged as the fight went out of him. "They approached me 2 years ago. Said they needed local law enforcement to look the other way occasionally. The money was good, and they promised nobody would get hurt." "But people did get hurt," Catherine said, "starting with my husband." "I swear to you, Catherine, I didn't know they were planning to hurt James. I thought he'd really had a heart attack until you started asking questions this morning." Marshal Davidson holstered his weapon. "Sheriff, you're under arrest. But if you cooperate fully with our investigation, we might be able to work something out." As Bean was being handcuffed, Catherine realized her situation had fundamentally changed. With federal marshals involved, she had protection from Morrison's immediate threats. But she also had evidence that could bring down a conspiracy reaching into the territorial governor's office. "Marshals," she said, "there's more. Much more. My husband documented 5 years of operations, including bribes to judges and politicians. This isn't just about a few stolen banks. It's about systematic corruption of territorial government. Marshal Cole exchanged glances with his partner. Mrs. Brennan, if what you're telling us is true, you're sitting on evidence that could trigger federal intervention in territorial affairs. Are you prepared for that kind of attention? Catherine thought about Morrison's threat that morning, about the photograph proving they were watching her, about her husband lying dead because he'd tried to do the right thing. Marshal, 3 hours ago, Morrison's people threatened to kill me if I talked to anyone about James's death. I'd say I'm already getting more attention than I can handle. Then let's see exactly what your husband left behind, Davidson said. And Mrs. Brennan, you're going to need federal protection. This kind of evidence makes you the most valuable witness in the territory and the most dangerous target. As Catherine led the marshals to James's secret deposit box, she realized her quiet life as a small-town banker's widow was over. She was about to become the key witness in a federal investigation that would either bring justice for James's death or get her killed by the same people who'd murdered him. But looking at the badges on the marshals' coats, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced since finding James dead in their bed. Hope that the truth might actually matter to someone with the power to act on it. The territorial courthouse in Phoenix buzzed with unprecedented activity. Federal marshals, territorial prosecutors, and Justice Department investigators had descended on Arizona like locusts, following the evidence Catherine had provided about Morrison's conspiracy. 3 weeks had passed since she'd first revealed James's hidden. All counts. Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced since the morning she'd discovered the forged promissory note. Complete satisfaction that justice had been served. But her personal victory was overshadowed by the broader implications of the case. The territorial governor had been forced to resign. 2 federal judges had been impeached. The entire territorial banking system had been reformed under federal oversight. James's death had triggered changes that would reshape the American Southwest for generations. 1 year later, Catherine stood in her new office in the Justice Department building in Santa Fe, looking out at the mountains that had become her new home. The brass nameplate on her door read, Catherine Brennan, Special Prosecutor, Financial Crimes Division, the first woman to hold such a position in territorial history. Her desk was covered with case files from across the Southwest. Morrison's conviction had encouraged other victims of financial fraud to come forward, and Catherine had built a reputation as the prosecutor who could untangle even the most complex schemes. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Marshal Davidson entered, carrying a telegram and wearing the expression of someone bringing news he wasn't sure how to deliver. Catherine, this came from the Denver field office. They've arrested 3 men trying to restart Morrison's operation using a different name. She took the telegram, scanning its contents quickly. The Phoenix Group. How creative. Same methods, different letterhead? Looks like it. But here's the interesting part. They were using some of Morrison's old associates, people who avoided prosecution by cooperating with our investigation. Catherine felt the familiar surge of anger she experienced whenever criminals tried to exploit the system designed to rehabilitate them. Who's the lead prosecutor on the case? That's why I'm here. Denver's requesting you specifically. They want the prosecutor who destroyed Morrison's original organization to handle the follow-up cases. Catherine looked around her Santa Fe office, the first space that had truly belonged to her since leaving Tombstone. She'd built a new life here, established herself as a force in territorial law enforcement, found purpose in work that honored James's memory by protecting others from the criminals who'd killed him. How long would I be in Denver? Probably 6 months, maybe longer depending on how many defendants they arrest. It's a significant commitment. Catherine walked to the window, thinking about the choice before her. She'd spent the past year prosecuting financial fraud across New Mexico territory, winning convictions that had restored millions of dollars to victims and sent dozens of criminals to federal prison. It was satisfying work that used all her skills and served justice for people who'd been victimized by corrupt systems. But Denver represented something different. It was a chance to completely eliminate Morrison's criminal legacy, to ensure that her husband's killers and their associates could never again victimize innocent families. Marshal, when do they need an answer? End of the week. But Catherine, there's something else you should know. The Justice Department is considering creating a permanent financial crimes division with federal prosecutors stationed in major cities across the West. If you take the Denver assignment and it goes well, you'd be the leading candidate to head the new division. Catherine turned from the window, intrigued despite herself. A permanent federal unit focused specifically on financial fraud? Based on the success you've had with the Morrison cases and the subsequent prosecutions here in Santa Fe, your methods have become the model for investigating complex financial conspiracies. The idea appealed to Catherine more than she'd expected. Since James's death, she discovered that her true calling wasn't running a small-town bank, but fighting the kind of large-scale corruption that destroyed lives and undermined faith in legitimate institutions. What would heading this division involve? Building a team of prosecutors and investigators, establishing field offices in major cities, coordinating with territorial governments to identify and prosecute financial fraud before it becomes systematic. Davidson smiled. Essentially, you'd be doing what you did with Morrison's organization, but on a national scale. Catherine realized she was looking at an opportunity to transform her personal tragedy into a career that could prevent thousands of other families from experiencing what she'd endured. James's death had opened her eyes to the scope of financial corruption in the territories. Now she had a chance to fight that corruption systematically. I'll take the Denver assignment, she said finally. And if the Justice Department decides to create this financial crimes division, I want to be considered for the leadership position. I hoped you'd say that. The train to Denver leaves Thursday morning. After Davidson left, Catherine began packing her personal items, preparing for another move in what had become a nomadic career. But this time she wasn't running from danger or grief. She was moving toward an opportunity to expand the work James had started with his meticulous documentation of Morrison's crimes. As she packed James's photograph, the only personal item she'd kept from their Tombstone life, Catherine reflected on how much had changed since that morning when she discovered the forged promissory note. The frightened widow who'd negotiated with her husband's killers had become a federal prosecutor who dismantled one of the largest criminal conspiracies in territorial history. But more than her career had changed. Catherine had discovered that her true strength didn't come from the security of running a small bank or the comfort of a predictable life. It came from fighting for justice, from using her skills to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, from ensuring that criminals like Morrison faced consequences for their actions. James would have been proud of what she'd become. The careful, methodical banker who documented evidence of corruption had married a woman who'd found the courage to use that evidence to seek justice. Their partnership had continued even after his death, as Catherine built on his work to create something larger than either of them could have achieved alone. The train to Denver would carry her toward new challenges and new opportunities to fight financial crime, but it would also carry her toward the next phase of a career that had begun with a forged signature and a murdered husband, and had grown into something that could reshape how the federal government fought corruption in the American West. Epilogue: The Legacy, 20 to 22 minutes. Denver, Colorado, 1885. Catherine Brennan stood before the largest courtroom in Colorado Territory, addressing a jury in the final trial stemming from Morrison's criminal organization. 2 years had passed since she'd first discovered James's hidden evidence, and the legal aftermath was finally drawing to a close. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd become the territory's most respected prosecutor, "this is the last trial involving Morrison's conspiracy, but it represents something more important than just another conviction." She gestured toward the defendant's table, where 3 men sat facing charges of attempting to restart Morrison's criminal enterprise using new names and methods. "This trial represents the principle that crime doesn't pay, that corruption cannot hide behind respectability, and that justice will follow criminals no matter how many times they try to reinvent themselves." The Denver courtroom was packed with spectators, journalists, and other prosecutors who'd come to watch Catherine conclude the most complex financial fraud case in territorial history. Her reputation had grown beyond the Southwest Eastern. Newspapers regularly covered her trials, and law schools had begun inviting her to speak about prosecuting white-collar crime. But Catherine's greatest satisfaction came from the victims, who'd approached her after each trial to thank her for returning their stolen property and bringing their tormentors to justice. Families who'd lost ranches, businesses, and life savings to Morrison's organization had seen their property restored and their faith in legal institutions renewed. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. As the final defendants were led away in shackles, Catherine felt a chapter of her life closing. Morrison himself had died in federal prison 6 months earlier, taking the last of his secrets with him. His criminal organization had been completely dismantled, its methods exposed, its victims compensated. James's death had been avenged, but, more importantly, his evidence had prevented countless other families from suffering similar losses. After the trial, Catherine walked to the Denver train station, where Marshal Davidson was waiting with a telegram from Washington. The Justice Department had made their decision about the Permanent Financial Crimes Division. "Congratulations, Director Brennan," Davidson said, handing her the official appointment. "You're now head of the Federal Financial Crimes Division, with offices planned for San Francisco, Denver, Chicago, and New York." Catherine read the appointment letter, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. She was about to become one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country, responsible for investigating financial fraud across multiple states and territories. "There's something else," Davidson continued. "The president wants to meet with you next month to discuss expanding federal law enforcement capabilities. Your success with the Morrison cases has attracted attention at the highest levels of government." Catherine folded the letter and looked around the Denver station, where she derived 2 years earlier as a widow seeking justice for her murdered husband. Now she was leaving as a federal official, whose career had been shaped by that quest for justice. But she wasn't leaving alone. Over the past 2 years, she'd assembled a team of investigators and prosecutors who shared her commitment to fighting financial corruption. They would form the core of her new division, carrying forward the principles James had died defending. The train to Washington would mark another transition in Catherine's journey from small-town banker's wife to federal law enforcement official. But it would also represent continuity, the same dedication to truth and justice that had motivated James to document Morrison's crimes would now guide a national effort to protect American businesses and families from financial predators. As the train pulled away from Denver, Catherine opened James's photograph one more time. The man looking back at her had been a quiet hero whose courage in confronting corruption had cost him his life, but had ultimately protected thousands of innocent people. "We did it, James," she whispered to the photograph. "We made sure the truth mattered." Outside the train windows, the American West rolled past. Mountains and plains where families were building new lives, establishing businesses, trusting in institutions that were now protected by laws James's evidence had helped create. Catherine Brennan was no longer the debt collector's target or the banker's widow. She was the architect of a new approach to fighting corruption, a woman whose personal tragedy had become a national triumph over organized crime. The silver dollar that had started her story had landed tails up, meaning she was supposed to pay a debt she'd never owed. Instead, she'd collected a debt that was rightfully hers, justice for her husband's death and protection for countless future victims of financial fraud. The gamble had paid off, but the real winner wasn't Catherine Brennan. It was the principle that in America, truth and justice could triumph over even the most sophisticated criminal conspiracy, as long as ordinary citizens had the courage to stand up and fight for what was right.